Hello, everyone. Our guest tonight is Lisa Forbes. Lisa grew up on the south side of Chicago. An ex-con in her 30s, she started her own company, Lisa Forbes Incorporated, to help restored citizens cope with post-prison life. Based in Denver, she has spoken widely and conducted many workshops. Previously, she was the state communications director for the League of Women Voters of Colorado. Forbes now edits her local county league's monthly newsletter, The Voter. Additionally, Forbes is a Colorado coordinator of Better Angels, a national citizens movement to bring liberals and conservatives together at the grassroots level. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Happy to be here.
Yes. I wanted to thank you and Steerforth and Anthony Lasasso at Steerforth for helping set up this event. Before we get into what I think will be a very interesting conversation, I want to give, because we read your bio, but there's a portion of your book that gives a synopsis of everything that you've had to experience and endure in your life. So I wanted to just read through that because it's a lot, and I want people to have a good expectation of what you've gone through. So from your personal experience, you've gone through sexual abuse, bullying, religious abuse, living in public housing projects, single teenage parenthood, incarceration, eviction, unemployment, underemployment, living on welfare, job stress, working two jobs just trying to make it, divorce, homelessness, physical health problems, domestic violence, depression, suicidal thoughts, and PTSD. That is quite a list. And the book fully goes into everything that you experienced. And we were talking before we went live here that this book really started as what your editor described more as a white paper, where you wanted more, so like the last couple of chapters to be the book, and what was your editor's take on that thought?
Yeah, so I wanted to say the things that I felt would be solutions. I really didn't write the book initially to focus on myself, my own story. I just wanted to say, there are things that we are missing in this conversation that really need to be addressed. And so I wrote the last couple of chapters of the book thinking that that would be the book. And when I sent it to the editor, he said, this is a great part of a book. But the problem is that no one knows why they should be listening to you talk about these things. So unfortunately, even though you don't really want to tell all of your story, you're going to have to invite people to know who you are in order to give them a reason for why they should be listening to you. And essentially, it was that, what's your authority? And so when people say, oh, I've got this degree and I've, been doing this for how many years, my authority is my story. My authority is my lived experiences. When I say what needs to be done, what would really be helpful, what would make a permanent difference, I'm not speaking from theory. I'm speaking from experience. And so that's why the book became a memoir with the last chapter folded into it.
And the book that I failed to say at the beginning of this is I Can Take It From Here, a memoir of trauma, prison, and self-empowerment. To get into the discussion, you like to use the phrase restored citizen. What does that phrase mean to you, and why do you prefer that to the alternative of, I felt weird because I know that you prefer restored citizen, and then in your bio it was ex-con. So I'm like, do I? So can you explain the phrase restored citizen?
Well, in the book, I really emphasize how much I believe identity is destiny, that you really can't outperform the way you view yourself. And how you view yourself is one of the keys to determining that is what do you call yourself. And so I never liked the term ex-con because it just refers to the past. It doesn't tell you who I am now. A lot of people use the term returning citizens. And I get the fact that people are returning, to the society, to workforce. But my problem was that in the 14 years of my incarceration, I had seen people be returning citizens and then return right back to prison. I wanted to come up with something that said this was a permanent status change. And how I came up with restored citizens was actually when I was incarcerated, I read the Bible. And there's a scripture in the Bible that says that God will restore to you the years that the locust and the cankerworm and the caterpillar had devoured and eaten up. And when I read that scripture, I said, that's what I want. I want my years restored. I want the time that I spent being abused and being incarcerated. I want that time restored so that I could become the person I would have been had I not been suffering everything that I had gone through. And so the word restored stuck to me, and that was the significance of it to me. That when you come out, you are restored to your rightful place. And that is how you identify yourself.
And religion played a big part throughout your life,
Mhm.
not always in a positive light. Where do you stand with your faith now, and how has that been guiding you since
Well, I have
refining it?
studied I've studied many, many religions as I describe in the book. I've studied various forms of Christianity. I studied various forms of Islam. I studied Scientology. I studied Judaism. I studied Buddhism. And what I found in all of them was a common theme, which is that when you take away the parts that we presume have been added by organized religion, really it's just a question of, it's as simple as treating other people like you want to be treated. It's as
Mhm.
simple as God is love. I like to say if something's not God, not love, it's not God. So my problem with a lot of religions was that it just seemed to not, it seemed to be that people had reduced God to being a really angry man. you know
Mhm.
and so all of their religious principles then had, it was like you weren't really striving to be like God. You're shrinking God to be like you. And I just felt like if we reverse that, if we really just keep the overarching theme of God is love, and there are so many things that we do in the name of religion that really don't have anything to do with God. And so I'm comfortable with people of all faiths because I can see that, having read most of their books, I can see the common theme throughout all of them.
That makes a lot of sense. Because you don't dance around anything in your book, and you're very blunt with a lot of the topics. I don't want to dance around about the topic of how you got into prison, and the can you tell us that story of what led you to the path of making the decision that you did,
Mhm.
and the ending results.
Well, so there was a morning where I had moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. My parents still lived in Chicago. And I was just going to surprise them with a visit. I had a 2-year-old daughter. It was a Sunday morning. I was just going to surprise them. When I got to their apartment, they were not home. And I realized they were at their Kingdom Hall. They are Jehovah's Witnesses. And so my daughter's father didn't live too far from them. So I was just going to wait. It was December. It was cold. I was just going to go to his house with her, let him visit her, wait for them to come, and really just have a visit and go back home that evening. And then when I got to James's house, first, let me just say that, start off by saying there actually isn't a way to describe what happened that makes it make sense. It was
Mhm.
really an emotional, complete breakdown. And I also do take full responsibility for what happened. I do not write this story to try to justify myself in any way. So I want to make that clear. But so I went to James's house, and somebody looked out the window and pulled the curtain back and then closed it again. And I thought, that wasn't James. I knew it wasn't James, and he wouldn't see. Even if he would have left me sitting outside, he wouldn't have left our 2 year old sitting outside in the cold. And at that time, I just started having this feeling like something must be wrong. And I explained in the book how I had these constant feelings of like death being near, and then I would go into dream-like states, and just really a lot of emotional trauma. As I write, that when people say, well, why didn't you just leave? Well, at the moment, I could only make the decision that my mind would let me make. And so
Mhm.
at that moment, I just really had an irresistible impulse to get in the house. And ironically, I felt that something was happening in the house to James, because he wouldn't have done that. And maybe I need to get in the house and see who that was at the window. And so I walked around. I went to a grocery store a couple of blocks away, and as I was walking around, I just kept feeling like something's wrong. Maybe I'll need to defend myself when I get in the house. I'll just make sure that I at least have a knife or something with me. So I bought a knife. I didn't leave home with a weapon. I didn't leave home with any intention of committing a crime. I bought a knife thinking something is wrong in that house. I might need something. So when I went back to the house, and then a woman let me in who I recognized her. James had introduced me to her as his cousin. But as the conversation went on after I got in, it was clear that she was not his cousin at the time. I thought she was his girlfriend. I didn't find out until the police told me later on that she was actually his wife.
Mhm.
But she let me in, and James started mocking me and just, humiliating me. And the only thing I can say, Bob, is that in that moment, I just really had a moment where I just felt so humiliated, so stupid, And I
Mhm.
describe it as, sorry, there's an ambulance going by. I describe it as a moment in which all of my history converged into a single moment onto a single person. And when I looked at that situation, I looked at the other people that I didn't know that was in the house. I looked at James. I started looking around. I had this weird dream-like state wash over me. And I was so angry and so humiliated. I basically just unwrapped the knife. It was still in the wrapper. And I stabbed James once in the chest. And it was really just a horrendous breakdown of punishing James in a single moment for everything that had been my life. It just triggered all the sexual abuse, all the humiliation from my family, all the parental, mockery, it just, so there's no way to really describe it in a way that makes sense without factoring in how traumatized I was when I got there already. I always tell
Mhm.
people, if I had been on my jury, I would have convicted me too. It's not anything that makes sense. It was just the effect of the state of mind that trauma had put me in.
Mhm.
And I just reacted with a emotional breakdown.
Thank you for sharing that story. I think it's important for people to understand what led you into prison. But your book and the purpose of your book is to try to change what happens when you get out of prison. So you spent 14 years in prison, and I enjoy what you had shared about your experience there in terms of the amount of reading that you did and what you were able to learn from that, and kind of your education in prison and your literal education, the degrees and certificates that you were able to pick up along the way.
Mhm.
Um, so it seems, other than, and I don't want to spoil the whole, not that it's a fiction book, but spoil anything for people reading it. Um, Other than the moment of trying to escape prison, you had a pretty model prisoner experience of trying to do all of the right things to get out and get back to whatever your life is going to be after that.
Mhm.
Um, so even with doing all of those things, you leave prison. What's your experience in the early days and months and year of after leaving prison?
Well, I had worked as a secretary beforehand. I was very literate. I had office skills. So I thought, surely, I'm going to just be able to get out and get a job and go on with my life. And so I went to one of the huge organizations that work with helping prisoners get jobs, reentry services, and things in Chicago. And the first thing they told me was, that the Illinois Department of Corrections had put it on my release papers that I was not eligible to work because I needed therapy. And I thought, okay, I've been sitting in your day room for 14 years. If you felt like I needed therapy, why didn't you give it to me there? Why would
Mhm.
you put it on my release papers and do it in such a way that prevents reentry organizations affiliated with the Department of Corrections from assisting me? So that was my first real feeling that there's not actually any desire to help me. I began to see one of the reasons for the recidivism rate, which is that you have a lot of organizations that really look good on paper, and we get this booklet of places to go and people to call, and I was calling them and no one would help me. And even those people who, might have wanted to help me, there because of the nature of my crime, they were not allowed. I mean, they wouldn't touch me. I don't. There's a lot of places,
Mhm.
even their grant funders won't allow them to work with people who have violent crimes. So that was my first clue that there's an entire group of people who are also coming out of prison for whom the reentry services don't apply to us. They apply to nonviolent offenders, they apply to drug offenses, but if you had a first degree murder, they would not touch you. And the irony of that, Bob, was that as I write in the book, that it's really a false distinction, the nonviolent criminal versus the violent criminal, because there are many people who are in prison for nonviolent offenses just because that's the offense they happen to have been arrested for. But they are, in fact, very violent people. And they
Mhm.
have a long history of violence against people for which they were not caught. Meanwhile, there are people who are in prison for a single violent act committed while they were in a state of mental breakdown, like I was, who had no other history of violence, who were not innately violent. And we were considered the violent people. So um, it's a real lack of getting to the root causes of what causes crime. Who is a violent offender, who should really be helped, and how. Because if you're just slapping labels on people based upon the conviction in front of you, you're missing a huge core of people who are not allowed to re-enter the way they could. I mean, I was not an innately violent person. I just had a single breakdown. And so those are the types of things that I began to understand, not looking just at myself, because my first thought was, well, I can't be this special. I've got to be a part
Mhm.
of a group. This has to apply to other people. And so then I was able, because I was literate, to kind of work around these things and find work. And I had a paralegal certificate, so I was able to get someone to really just hire me. But most people in prison, there's a huge population of them who are not literate. And so I began to think, if I'm having these problems, how much is of the recidivism rate can be attributed to other people not being able to work around the system that's really set
Mhm.
up for them to fail?
I One of the big takeaways that I had from your book towards the end was that difference that you had addressed, and even from like the liberal left standpoint of, oh well, these are this is the going to be the political party that actually wants to do something, but even somebody like Kamala Harris and Beto O'Rourke are making that distinction. And before reading your book, I would have just gone along with that thought of, oh yeah, there's the nonviolent offenders, as they say, and then the violent criminals. And
Hmm.
you make the distinction that they're they that they are of when you're nonviolent, you're just an offender. When you're violent, you're a criminal.
Right.
And it's one of the reasons that I have been pushing your book so much to people, to be able to develop that understanding and perspective from hearing it from your point of view, because it is a huge distinction between the two. And even if the person isn't violent, that is the nonviolent offender, just based on the number of things that they could have done and the harm that they could have caused, even if it wasn't violent,
Mhm.
why does that mean that they get to have their voting rights restored? But somebody who had a violent moment doesn't. It's opens up a lot of great questions for the post prison population.
And,
Um,
and it would be different, Bob, if you were talking about, a small number of people, or people say, oh, well, I don't think they should be getting out anyway, they killed somebody or whatever. And I understand where people are coming from with that, but the fact of the matter is that almost everybody in prison is coming out. Regardless of their sentence, at some point, almost everyone currently in prison will be out. And so when we make these distinctions and don't help these large masses of people who are coming out anyway, who have served 10, 15, 20 years, and they're now, you may not think they're out, but they have served their time. What do we want to do with these people? We can't simply ignore them. We can't pretend that they're not there. And we can't, I mean, many of the, when I went into prison when I was 19. So when I came out, I was in my early 30s, but that's young,
mhm,
And so if you write me off forever as a violent criminal, well, she shouldn't have been out, but I am out. And there are millions of people like me who have served their sentences. So second chance initiatives are great. I support them. I support criminal justice reform, but I am quick to tell people that those types of reforms would not have helped me. They wouldn't have helped millions of people like me. They wouldn't, and most importantly, they wouldn't have prevented the crime that I committed. And we need to be
mhm.
looking at crime prevention, because it's great for people to go in and say they have restored themselves and they're never going to commit another crime, but it doesn't undo what has been done. How much better would it have been if someone had been able to intercept me before that breakdown happened and prevent the crime? So I would really like to see us have conversations about working at the root of things rather than chopping at
Mhm.
the leaves and the branches, which is what I really feel like most of our work is at the moment.
I always try to find a way to relate to the author from my own personal experience, and from a very micro level. Um, I have an arrest story, and the way that it affected me in that time period of while I was waiting for everything to kind of eventually go away, and my record is clean now. But as you were telling your story, I'm like, oh, there was some parallels to what was going on. The fact that you bought your knife the same day. I was a TV and film major in school. I was playing the role of a police officer for a movie that we were shooting. I bought a airsoft pistol, and I was driving down to our school. I was actually driving on the way back up because it rained and we weren't able to shoot the thing that we were film that the scene that we were going to do. So I was driving back up. I had this prop gun on my passenger seat. Me just not thinking that it's a gun in my passenger seat. I had it in my hand and I was just flicking the safety on and off like I was clicking a pen, like I always have a pen in my hand. I
Mhm.
wasn't waving it around. It was just there, but a truck driver looked down and saw a gun in my hand, and that it was in my hand pointed at in his general direction. So he rightfully called the police. A large section of the thruway was shut down. I was arrested. I'm glad that it happened before social media was what it was. Um, but I had to go through the whole process of going to court. I ended up taking a plea deal because I'm like this was a whole ridiculous situation that like this was very bad luck, and I don't want to try my luck with a jury. So
Mhm.
I will take a plea deal. So it ended up being a year long adjournment contemplating dismissal. So I had that just kind of hovering over my record, during that time period, I in the interim, like it was the summer. I was looking for a summer job. I applied for a job. I applied for the job. The interview went so well that they like immediately sent me up to the next manager to interview with. They offered me the job that day. I'm like, oh great. And then I left. And then a few days went by and they did a background check and that popped up on my background.
Mhm.
And then they took the job away. So that was my very micro level of what you had to experience for a very long time,
Right.
probably still, where you're trying to do all of the right things. And just for the sake of giving people perspective of what you had to go through, can you tell us a story of trying to change apartments in the complex that you had already been living in?
hmm So I had moved into this apartment. I had just moved to Denver, Colorado, where I live now, and I had been living there for a couple of years, and I just decided I wanted more space. I was trying to rebuild a life. I had started really buying things that I thought would be permanent. I even bought like cast iron skillets and things like that because I was it was my way of saying to myself, this is a permanent change for me. And so when I just decided I wanted another bedroom, I went to the leasing office and asked about switching, and they said, well, when a person wants another apartment in the complex, they still treat it like a new application. And so when I had applied the first time, I applied under my married name. And it's funny because I didn't quite understand that because I still had the same social security number.
Hmm.
But for some reason, the background check came up clear and I got the apartment. In the entire process of regaining my life and everything, I had gone back to my maiden name. And when I reapplied for a larger apartment, they ran it in my maiden name, and it came up. The background check came up, and they called me at work, and they were like, "We have a problem," And my heart just sank because you know, I immediately knew what it was. It's like, okay, I can't talk about this right now. But I basically came home and they had already decided that they were going to evict me. And they, after being there for 2 years, as soon as the background check came up, they gave me a 72-hour notice to quit, get off the premises. And I had nowhere to go. I had an apartment full of stuff. I didn't have a car. And I wound up just throwing a lot of my things in the dumpster and moving into basically an extended motel. So, again, I had a job. I was working at a law firm. I was a paralegal. And every time I turn around, this thing keeps popping up from my past and snatching the rug out from under me. And this is something that many people experience. Now, one of the things that I was not experiencing that a lot of people do is they're trying to do this with small children.
Hmm.
They come out, they're trying to get an apartment, they're trying to get their kids back, or they've got their kids, and they every time you turn around, they're in a shelter or something. So it's just really a horrific experience of you never get past the past. No matter how much you're trying to do what is right now, and how much that is also under how much the root of that is trauma. One of the things that I really wanted to emphasize in the book was that recidivism and trauma are really as connected as crime and trauma. Uh, Numerous studies show that the vast majority of incarcerated people were traumatized prior to prison and while in prison. And so there is a clear connection between trauma and incarceration. And while it is true that not every traumatized person goes on to commit a crime, that is a fact that must be recognized, that the vast majority of people incarcerated have experienced childhood trauma or some kind of domestic abuse or sexual abuse or something. There's a clear connection between why people commit crimes, which and the trauma that underlies that, and which again is another part of the conversation in second chance initiatives and many reentry organizations that I feel is not addressed. Because if I come out, if you're I'm dealing with a really traumatized person, even as I was, you can go to an organization, I can give you a job, but can you keep the job?
Hmm.
I can give you an apartment, but can you keep the apartment? A lot of times when you go on a job and the first time your employer says something to you that you don't like or tells you what to do, you have this overreaction and people are wondering what is wrong with you. They don't realize that that is just triggering something that was already there. And so I really wanted to emphasize in telling my story, in which you led off with my brief bio of all the different things I had experienced, all the trauma that I had experienced that had never been processed, that had never been addressed, much of it had never been confronted even by me, was still limiting the choices that I was able to make. It was still limiting the vision that I had of myself. I was still feeling like I needed to live in the shadows and still, not having great relationships with people, even though there was a part of me that wanted these things. The part of me that was traumatized was just getting constantly triggered. And so that was just another trigger that said this is pointless, and I wound up being in an extended living motel for the next couple of years. While working at a law
Hmm.
firm, it was really a dichotomy. I would put on my little suit and go to work and at a law firm and try to function with all these lawyers and then go home and basically be in a transient place. So it was
Hmm.
a very difficult thing to try to live in these two worlds, and while at the same time realizing that I needed to find something that was actually going to set me free so that I would get off this treadmill and finally be able to create permanent change, which was what I wanted to show people was possible in the book. That is that you don't have to perpetually feel like, I just have to be grateful for whatever I can get. I got all these degrees in prison. I got all these certificates, but I have this minimum wage job where I can't even afford to take care of myself, but I just have to be grateful for that. No, I wanted people to get to the point where they could be restored to what they could have been making had they not, you know, had that trauma or had that experience. And so I wanted what I had been through to really count for something. I wanted people, sometimes, it's hard to, people say it's hard to be what you can't see. And so a
Hmm.
lot of people, say, well, when I talk to them about, reentry, the first thing they'll say is, yeah, but that doesn't apply if you've got a violent crime, if you got a murder. And I wanted people to say, you just can't write people off like that. I'm not talking theory because this is the proof. I'm standing here with the charge you're talking about. It is possible for you to have permanent resolution of trauma and permanent change, therefore, to your life. And that was really the whole purpose of the book.
How did you first make the connection personally that a lot of the issues that you were dealing with were connected to your trauma, and how did you start to deal with that?
Well, I made the connection because I had been incarcerated for 14 years. And after I had been out for only 9 months, I got married. And so I was the youngest of six children. The man I married was my father's age and had five children older than me. So I realized I had immediately recreated my childhood, being
Hmm.
back to the youngest of six children, married to someone my father's age. And that was the first clue to me that, wait a minute, I've been here before. And then, so in that marriage, when I basically started having the same, I mean, he might as well have been my mother. His children might as well have been my siblings. It was really almost a down to the last detail, complete recreation of my childhood trauma. When I realized that and the marriage began to fall apart, I just went online and basically started searching for childhood repeating patterns, trauma. Just did a search, and I came upon a website by a man named Brad Yates. And he was talking about the emotional freedom technique, which I had never heard of, but he had videos and scripts you could follow. And just, it's basically tapping on the Chinese acupuncture points a system that's
Mhm.
been around for thousands of years. So it's not like some newfangled thing, but instead of using needles, you just tap on those same points. And as you're tapping, you start off, you can start off with a script if you've never done it before. But as you begin using the script, your own words will come out. And I began to vocalize things that I had never said before to anybody. And I really began to see each time I did it that I was a little bit clearer. I was a little bit lighter, and I was having a lot of physical reactions too that I described in the book. It was releasing a lot of things. I was crying. I was running to the bathroom sometimes after it was. I could tell that I was having a physical release from it, and it was working. I was feeling less triggered. I was feeling less chronically angry, and so uh, I realized, wow, if this could help me, this could probably help a lot of people because a lot of people have not been as traumatized as I've been. A lot of people has not done as much time as I've done. So I felt like if it could help the so-called worst of the worst, it could help really a lot of other people. And the thing that made it most valuable to me was because I didn't need any money to do it. If I had needed money, if I had needed to go somewhere to talk to somebody, to do something, in order to get the help, I wouldn't have gotten it because I had been laid off at that time from the job where I was working in Atlanta, Georgia at the time. They were doing commercial real estate, and the market had bottomed out. And so I was laid off. So I didn't have a job, I didn't have a car. I didn't, the house I was in was in pre foreclosure. I didn't have any money. I couldn't go anywhere. I needed something where I could sit and have no clothes, no money, no insurance, no anything, and still get help. And that's what EFT represented for me. It represented a way for me to help myself. And then I realized people could also be doing this sitting in their cells if they're not out. If they don't have money, they can sit wherever if you're in a shelter, you can sit here and do this. That was the value of EFT for me. It was something I could do for myself. It was effective, it was free, and it worked.
I want to talk a bit about your relationship with the family. Well, kind of everyone within your circle, because you had approached this book wanting more to go after the last couple of chapters, and then it
Mhm.
became more of a memoir. Have you had? Did you approach your family and the people in your life before telling these stories? Have they read the book? What have what's the feedback been to it?
Some of them have read the book and been supportive. Others have had different reactions. My mother has chosen not to believe what's in the book. She said, and one of my sisters, they basically have the same response. They said, I don't believe that a lot of those things could have happened right up under our noses. But the reality is things happen right up under people's noses all of the time. And I
Hmm.
explain in the book how that happened. And then especially if you're not, being present with a child anyway, anything could be happening and you wouldn't know it. So, but that was their feeling, was basically that they felt that this couldn't have happened right up under their nose. But it did. But other people, have been supportive, and especially extended family who are not Jehovah's Witnesses. Among my immediate family who are Jehovah's Witnesses, there's this very clannish, cultish kind of mentality. And so it's just not accepted to talk about certain things or whatever. But I wanted to tell my story because, first of all, I had some suspicion that I wasn't even the only person in the family who had some sexual abuse. And then obviously for people who were incarcerated, I wanted them to be able to see that someone who had done as much time as they had done, who had committed maybe a worse crime than they had committed, had been able to get free from the trauma that it had caused. But as I began to talk to other people, and people who had not been incarcerated began to tell me that they could relate to certain stories in the book, that they could relate to the issue of trauma. Then that's when I began to realize it's really not a book just about restored citizens. It's a book about how we deal with trauma, period.
Hmm.
including restored citizens. But trauma is trauma. And so you don't really have to have ever been inside of a prison to be in a prison. You know, people are in prison in
Yep.
their homes. There are people who are in prison in relationships. And so as people began to tell me that they could relate to my story, and when they began to tell me their story, I realized it didn't have anything to do with incarceration. The people that I saw myself speaking to just became broader. I definitely wanted to maintain the connection that this book is written as a restored citizen, because we need to address people who are coming out. It's great that there's a lot of interest in second chance initiatives and reentry, but we really need to rework what is the most effective way to do that. But then it
Hmm.
is just as interesting a story or applicable a story to people who are experiencing trauma of any kind, that there is a way to free yourself from it that is a permanent change. And it's not something that you just keep doing over and over for the rest of your life.
And as you were going through the process of tapping and dealing with your trauma, I found it interesting how you kind of shifted what you wanted to get out of it, in terms of like if you needed to have forgiveness, but it was more got to the point of understanding to be able to develop a position of understanding. It was the goal.
Correct. Because, I like people say, well, you did this, you did that, whatever, you shouldn't have done it. I acknowledge all of that. And I don't write that to try to justify myself. But there was a point where I had to say, but I can't change that. I can't change what I did, but I could change who I was being. And by changing who trauma had twisted me into being, I could free myself to be something else. And once I could see myself as something else, my behavior would change. I really believe that identity is destiny, that you only can become what you can see yourself being and how you identify. I read a long time ago where someone said, it's not what other people call you, it's what you answer to that matters. And so
Hmm.
I didn't want to spend the rest of my life answering to that ex-con. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life answering to that traumatized child who was still running my life. I wanted to be the person who I would have been had all of that not happened to me, but maybe better, maybe with more wisdom, maybe with more understanding. And so that became what I wanted to tap on. Not that I could undo anything, but that I could make sure that what had happened was not repeatable in me. That was the best I could do. Make sure
Hmm.
that there was no danger that that act would be repeated, because the person who committed that act was healed. And it was really an unwell person who committed that act. And the only way to prevent that act from being repeated was to deal with the reasons why. And so I deal in the book, head on with the fact that I had to look myself in the mirror. And I couldn't just, as I say, stand over James's grave and tap on, me being great, right? I had to address what had happened, the impact that it had on other people. My daughter was still holding on to a doll that James had given her, when she was a year old. So I had to deal with all of those issues that, he had other children, he had relatives, and really just confronting the fact that my behavior had consequences, that I couldn't do anything about that, but I could make amends by making sure that it would never happen again, and then seeing how can I extend that then to other people as well. I mean, so I just, it really, it became to being about understanding what happened and making sure that it never happened again.
Hmm. So that's kind of where Lisa Forbes Incorporated comes into play.
Mhm.
Um, you being, it's kind of like the late night infomercials of I'm not only the president, I'm also a customer. Maybe it's the reverse,
Right,
but you
right.
you were the first client of Lisa Forbes Incorporated. What
Mhm.
is kind of the, and you've addressed it, but I just want to make sure it's clear for people listening. What's the main difference between what you're doing and what some of the nonprofits that you had consulted with and that exist are doing or have done?
Well, the main difference is that my focus is on what I really believe underlies most crimes, and which studies have shown underlines most crimes, and that is trauma. And that is why I was really so pleased to get the endorsement by Johnny Taylor, the president and CEO of the Society for Human Resource Management, because he really understood what I was trying to say in the book, which is that the services rendered by reentry organizations are necessary. But I really feel that in many ways they are the branches and the leaves on the tree. And the reason why you see the same people coming back for those services again and again is because what is feeding that tree is trauma. It is a root of trauma. And that is really my main focus. That if you get better communities by getting better people. You can't build a well community on sick people. And so trauma is an illness. It is, and the behavior that flows from it is a consequence of that illness. And if that was happening in a physical sense, everyone would recognize that. I wanted to say that that is also happening in an emotional sense. It is people overreacting to situations. If I had not already been as sick and as traumatized as I was from my childhood, when I met James, I would have had a completely different reaction to anything he had done. So,
Mm-hmm.
not to be cliche, but that old saying of the straw that broke the camel's back, many times that is what has happened when you see people who are incarcerated for really something small in isolation. When you put it in its context, you see that it is the trauma they brought with them from the past to that situation that caused them to just react in a completely inappropriate way. And I knew that from personal experience and from people that I had dealt with in prison. So I felt like there was something that a lot of the reentry organizations were missing. And that was the trauma that was underlying why the recidivism rate was so high, despite the good work that they were actually doing. So my focus is on trauma resolution.
That's
And
great.
and and really, my focus is on permanent change. It it's funny because if you have an organization and we're trying to bring down the recidivism rate because people are actually being restored back to citizenship, uh, then you actually really shouldn't be growing your organization every year, right?
Mm-hmm.
I approached what I want to do as if I'm doing this right, I'm going to be out of business one day, right? Because there's not going to really be
Yes.
any need for me. That's the difference. My focus is on permanent change. If I see you again in a year, you're not never going to be my favorite client. You're going to represent to me
Yeah.
that I've gotten to the root of what's wrong with that.
And I feel like what you're trying to do is needed in so many areas. We did an event last year, and it went into like Haiti relief efforts, and a lot of the nonprofit industry became an industry of if you're like exactly as you said, if you're doing the job that you're supposed to be doing well, eventually you should be out of a job. And I think for um, too many not I won't say a lot, but just too many nonprofit organizations, they aren't working their way out of existence
Right.
as they should be. Um, so you put this book out in your story into the world. What do you hope people will get from it? What kind of action steps do you hope people will take after reading it?
Well, my goal is to start a national conversation about recidivism in a different way. We've done a lot about first steps and second chances. And again, I feel like we haven't really addressed to a large extent what would be a permanent resolution to it. Just even, a lot of people that have gotten out already on first steps and second chances are already back in. And
Hmm.
even if a person doesn't go back into prison, that doesn't mean they're thriving. That doesn't mean they're doing well. So I really would love to see the national conversation about recidivism expand into what represents the best and most effective way to have permanent change, to bring the recidivism rate down, and to include all people who are coming out of prison. If you're limiting first steps and second chances to nonviolent people, we're just missing millions of people who
Hmm.
are still going to be out. And I mean, you really don't want a person who is has just paroled from a violent crime, whether you think they should be out or not, they are, to be your neighbor, and they've had no therapy, they've had no emotional freedom. Just it's really, to me, it's not just a public health issue, it's a public safety issue as well, to make people well when they come out, and then to apply it to people who are, as you said, in Haiti or to anywhere else. People, trauma is trauma. And so this can be applied to any people who are just not living the lives that they're capable of living, because trauma is like a chain around their neck. And I know from personal experience, with all the things that I had been through, when I see people walking down the street and they are clearly traumatized, I mean, they are talking to themselves, they are just really, Bob, when I see that person, I never see other. I look at whoever that person is and I see myself, because but for the grace of God and some other things that came into my life, I could easily have been in that situation. And so when I see that person, I see someone like me who, if they had the same tool that I had, they too would have a key to changing their life. EFT, emotional freedom technique, it was a tool that I used. And I see other people who are not any worse people than me. They just don't have the tool. And so what I wanted to do was show people that this tool worked, show them how simple it is to use, and show them that the permanent results that it made for me. And it doesn't have to be just incarcerated people. But, there are studies that have shown that there are some communities in our country where the trauma level is as high as it is in some war zones.
Hmm.
And so, you have kids who are experiencing PTSD. They're going to sleep hearing bullets. They're 10 years old. They've been to 12 funerals. All of you can't just act like them when this kid grows up and becomes a teenager who grabs a machine gun. It just came out of nowhere. This comes
Hmm.
from somewhere. And if we can get to the point where we can recognize a traumatized child when they're standing in front of us before it escalates into a crime, it would serve all of us. And that's really what I want to do.
I hope that a ton of people pick up your book, because as you were speaking, I was um, just thinking about the way I was looking at the book of it humanizes people, but it's not even just humanizing, but just creating that level of understanding and empathy that's so needed. Because it the I mean, there's a lot of struggles with this conversation, but to the point that we went into earlier of even the politicians that we can think are on our side that aren't end up not being on our side just for political reasons of, oh well, it's difficult to talk about prisoners and try to talk about how we want to help them because people on the outside don't see themselves as people that could be on the inside.
Right.
um, your book really illustrates how that can happen to anybody, and even if they don't think that that could happen to them, they at least get a sense of, oh well, like you're not a bad person.
Mhm.
um, so
Or
I hope a lot of people, yeah.
that the people are not irredeemable.
Hmm.
You can't just write off millions of people based on a conviction.
Yeah.
It's just we can't, and also we can't afford to lose these people out of the workforce. Imagine all these people. Imagine if I had not been able to work. If I had not been able to get a job. I went to school on the taxpayers' dime. I went on Pell Grants. I
Hmm.
got bachelor's degrees and paralegal degrees. Why should I not be in the workforce? And so I'm trying to get to people to the point where they get into the workforce at the level at which they are actually qualified to be there, not assuming that everyone who comes out of prison is only qualified to carry a mail bag. I am a paralegal. I've been a law firm administrator. Let me come out and work at the level at which I'm qualified, rather than assuming that these are all low skilled, minimum wage people of really not great use in the workforce, while employers struggle for qualified workers. Bring these people
Hmm.
into the workforce, but first get them to the point where they're emotionally ready to be there. There are just so many areas in which this serves us. It serves employers, it serves us for public health, it serves us for public safety, and we really need to incorporate this into the discussion about second chance initiatives and reentry.
So we're running out of time, but I just want to get in at least one more question. Are you trying to connect with people um, while they're still in prison, or are you meeting people that are heading out with
Both, in
okay.
and out. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Um, is there anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap up this evening?
Just that once again, the book is not necessarily just a prison memoir.
Hmm.
It is for people who have experienced trauma and are seeing how trauma is affecting their lives, affecting their children's lives, affecting public safety, affecting mass shootings by teenagers. I mean, we just have to really see that if we pull on the common thread of what we are attacking as individual problems, we can solve a lot of these problems at once by just dealing with the common thread that's underlying all of them, which is unresolved trauma.
Well, thank you very much. I think that your book will generate a lot of great conversations. I hope that is the case. Um, the book is available in our store, as well as if you're not local to us, you can order it through our website at goodneighborbooks.com, and it's on our homepage of our bookshop site there. Thank you so much, Lisa, for your time and for a great conversation tonight.
Thank you, Bob. I really appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye bye.